So what are some of the elements of effective prevention? One, that research, right, that I talked about is it uses evidence-based prevention programs, practices, and policies. I am going to pause right there and clarify to you, because throughout this session, you're going to hear me probably say prevention programs, but you're also going to hear me say practices, and you're going to hear me say policies, because that is something that as a new prevention provider some years ago, I had to learn that prevention wasn't only about a canned curriculum, right? A program that I pull off the shelf and then implements it, right? Prevention is bigger than that. It's more than that. It's about what are those practices that are evidence-based, but also policies. Because logically, there may be some things, some risk in your community, or the data may show that there are things that are going on in the community, right, that a program won't fix, but a policy will. So I don't want you to think that prevention is only about programs. It's about programs, it's about your community practices, and it's about those policies. Those are those ordinances and those laws that you are able to, as a prevention practitioner, to change, to work with a coalition, an organization, or a group to change. So it's not only about programs, but it's about evidence-based. There was a question in the chat about having access to the slides afterwards. And the answer to that is yes, you will have access to these slides after the training. So thank you for that question. What else are what are the other elements of effective prevention? It focuses on the outcome, right? It doesn't just focus on a program. It focuses on the outcome. Why am I emphasizing that? What I mean by that is that when you develop, when you have figured out, this is what we want to do in the community and why, or this is what's going on in my community, then you develop an outcome statement that says, we would like to increase this or decrease this. Then you design how you're going to get there. But your focus is not on your how, because usually your how is your program, your practice, or your policy. But the outcome is the thing that you're trying to get rid of. So there are many, or those are those things that you're trying to do. There are many different ways that you can get to an outcome. And I would like to have you remember that when you're doing your programs, it's about the outcome, because there may be different strategies that you will employ that will get you to your outcome, not just the program. If that program leaves, if that program isn't effective anymore, then I want you to point back to that outcome. And that is what effective prevention is. It focuses on the outcome, and it builds around that outcome by saying these are the different types of programs, practices, or policies that we could put around it. Okay, I'm gonna get to my next point, and then I'm gonna ask you questions. Prevention efforts are targeted across multiple domains, and they are facilitated by the use of environmental strategies. That is saying what I said before. As we went through our historical, the little history of how we evolved to doing strategic prevention framework now, there was this thing called comprehensive prevention, where we hit on different domains. One of those domains being young people, right? So we build our program around young people. Then we grow out and say, okay, now I'm gonna build my program around the youth, that the peers that impact that youth. So we have strategies that focus on peer-to-peer interactions. Then we build out more and say, well, what about the school domain? That's where young people are. That's where they thrive. That's where they come, every day for about 6-7 hours, right? So what type of strategies around prevention do I have in that domain, which is my school domain? And it isn't about, school domain isn't about your program being in the school. The school domain is about you changing the way that a school approaches prevention. Much different from, oh, we're working on the school domain because we're in the school. No, that still may be the individual domain. You're just in that school. School domain says you're working on things about that school. And does that school have a policy around prevention? The other data that supports this work that we're doing in prevention is called the asset approach, where there are 40 developmental assets in communities that we look at, that we point at. And when I say communities, I'm talking about those young people. There are assets that those young people have within them in order that we in prevention are building upon to make sure those are developed, right? So here you will see where that research is, where the Search Institute of Minneapolis have that research, and you have this supporting document to take you to those assets. One thing I want to say about that too is that as I was doing this work early on in prevention as well, we built a lot of our programs around those 40 developmental assets. And so the assets said, okay, there's a list of things that people tell young people not to do, but we built it upon it this way. What are these assets that are things that you can do, instead of teaching them in a negative way, like, hey, here's your list of things you can't do, in order to prevent substance misuse, don't do this, don't do that. Whereas the 40 developmental assets says, you know what, let me build on your strengths, let me build on your capacity within yourself in order for you to delay the onset of that substance in your life. And so we look at the developmental assets. That's another approach that has been taken in order to build on this body of work that we use in substance misuse prevention. The developmental asset framework does this. I just kind of said that. It emphasizes on the strengths in the individual. It focuses on the youth as a resource, not a problem. It focuses on increasing the number of assets that is within that young person. And then it's more of a promising framework. So the reason why it says promising framework is that we have different types of frameworks in the work that we do. We have promising practices and we have evidence-based strategies. And so that's a promising approach. If you use the developmental assets in your work, I love it to build it alongside of doing my work as I look at how I use the strategic prevention framework, as well as how I look at my risk and protective factors. They're all weaved in together as we do our work. Let me pause there real quickly. Nikki or Chelsea, are your hands still up, or did I forget to lower them? Okay, so I'm assuming that I forgot to lower them. Okay, so these are examples here of the 40 developmental assets. All good, thank you. So these are some of the assets that as we do our work and as you build on your evidence-based practice that you may have and your organization may have identified, or your promising approach or your standards-based program that you are building upon, that you look at the asset. That's what this prevention history has taught us, that the asset said that you give them, that young people receive support, that their neighbors encourage them, that they feel safe, that they have positive adult role models, that they feel valued, that they have family standards, that their parents feel that school helps, that they want to do well, that young people read for pleasure, they stand up for their beliefs, they're optimistic and life purpose, and they resist peer pressure. Those are some of the 40 developmental assets that we as prevention practitioners try to incorporate in the practice of our work. And we also connect that with the science and collecting the proper data to say, you know what, when we do that, that works. How often are we doing that? And does it impact the change or that we are trying to assess? Remember, I've been kind of throwing out risk and protective factors by the developers, Hawkins and Catalano. When I entered into the field of prevention, that was kind of my staple right there. Eliminating risk factors in communities and increasing the protective factors in community. And I continue, and the work that you see that is done, even if it's infused without speaking about the risk and protective factors, it points to that. Let me tell you why. Our research that I talked to you about finding out about, it's about what is the risk that's going on. What puts a young person at risk of using or misusing substance abuse? What are those things? Hawkins and Catalano came up with a wonderful list of these are all the risk factors, and they broke those down by domain. So all of this kind of comes together. So all the research was put together to give us a nice handle of not just going out and practicing and playing with this work, but really having it point to something that's going to make a difference. So the risk factors are associated with the health and risk behaviors in young people, right? And so I want you, and I will share with you the list, which I should have incorporated here, but I'll make sure that I get that to you. That's a promise. The risk and protective factors. So you have the list of risk factors like access to drugs, or access to alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. That's a risk factor. How does that walk itself out? That means that I can go from corner to corner, from store to store, and I can purchase, and I'm underage. That's a risk factor for me in my community. Pro-social alcohol behavior means that people who are, that's a risk factor, an example of one of the risk factors. That means that people around me feel that alcohol, tobacco, or drug use is not an issue. So the message that I am hearing is that, you know, my peers are saying it's okay. That's a risk factor. So as we think about those risk factors, we then think about, okay, what are those protective factors? So is it you have positive parental influence, you have communities that are safe and the environments are safe, there are places for me to go after school, there are activities for me to do, those are protective factors. So on one end, you have this list of things that put me at risk. There are billboards in my community, risk factor. Again, I have access to it, risk factor. I don't really have the language to say no, risk factor. Can this list be, so those are risk factors, and then the counter is protective factors. I'm reading Yvette's question. Can this list be shared with schools so they can educate teenagers on how to say no? I'll say this, Yvette. I will share this list with you today from my list, today or tomorrow, from my list of participants when we share the PowerPoint presentation. That's part A to my question. Part B to your question is so they can teach people how to say no. This is going to be a little more work to do because the risk and protective factors give us the research, give us the science around what we're looking at. And then your assessment helps you to see, okay, what are those risk factors in communities? And then you partner with that in order to do that work together. Tracy, you unmuted yourself. Is this something you wanted to share? Tracy?
Yeah, well,
I'm sorry?
Can you hear me, Tasha?
I can hear you now. Yes, sir.
I just want to check in so folks know that this risk and protective factors is a idea of remedies that can be used for communities, school systems, family systems, community systems. If they see them, they can utilize them.
Yep. Thank you. So that goes to your question. Is that you, Nick? Who was that asked that question? I want to make sure. That's Yvette. Yeah. So yes, I will share that with you. And like Tracy just said, that's a list that can be used, but you want to build a list that they can be used and look at it and see hey, what is really going on in our community. So I am going to share that with you, and it can build on a conversation about work that we can do in communities as it relates to building on these protective factors. And then the work we do is trying to eliminate these risk factors in our communities. Like I said, I love this list, and it's about 40 in their research. They found, I think it's about 40 risk factors and comparatively maybe 40 protective factors. So my promise to you is to share this with you when we share the slides. Okay. What other questions do you have for me? Let me do a temperature check. How are you guys doing? Give me a thumbs up, give me some hearts, give me some emotions so that I know that I'm on track. If you have questions, I need to get those questions, because what I don't want you to do is to get off the call, off the training today, and now I'll tell you this, if you have additional questions, then Trace is coming back, on the 30th, and he's going to talk to you more about that. However, but I don't want you to leave today, with thoughts in your head. So I saw thumbs up. I didn't see a lot of them. I saw thumbs up and hearts and all that. So I appreciate you guys for that. Thank you so much. So we would have taken a break, but let's get through this. So remember I talked about all of this. So the risk and protective factor. Remember I told you that when we first start doing this work, and as you do prevention work, it's comprehensive, right? And so this is an image of the risk and protective factors and where they rest or where they land. So you have community. One example is more than, these are just examples of them, but one example of a risk factor is in the community use messages, and community anti-ATOD use messages in the media. That's a factor in the community. That's a protective factor. Then you have in the school protective factor has, high expectations, rewards for positive performance. That's a protective factor. Then in the family, a protective factor is family attitudes about antisocial behaviors. That's a protective factor. What does that mean? Antisocial behaviors in the family. That means that mom and dad has set young person down and said, okay, this is what I need you to know about alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, or other things, other high risk things in communities. And hey, these are the things that I want you to know. There's some conversation about that, but there's some family bonding. There's some clear expectations. There's some rewards. And you see how the arrows say, this goes across, but then you have in purple community, but then we break down to the individual and the peers. They're in the same little sphere, right? The same domain. That means that the individual as well as their peers have a positive attitude about ATODs, right? Antisocial behaviors, social competency, and peer group norms, right? So in there, the attitudes about ATODs could be positive. That would be a risk factor. And then we're building out from the family, the school, community, all of these different protective factors that will influence the risk factor of that individual, okay? I don't have the proper competency skills in my social environment, right? That's why we teach life skills and all of that. That's a risk factor. We say, okay, if they don't have those skills, that's a risk factor. And then we're building them. The family is building them. The school is building them. The community is building them. Comprehensive approaches to the work that we do in prevention. We don't work in silos. We work collectively together, and we do this work together. I'll send you that list as well. So this is a definition more about the risk and protective factors, the strengths about them. Risk and protective factors exist in multiple contexts. They're correlated and cumulative. They have multiple outcomes, and then it has some influence over time. So that's just one point about the risk and protective factors. This is just a little more information and research about the protective factors, the risk and protective factors. It just says, it highlights what I've been saying so far. because people have relationships within their communities as well as the larger society. Each person's biological and psychological characteristics, they exist within multiple contexts. We know that. I just don't live in this house, right? I live in a community, which influences me, which I live in this society, which influences me. And so we're saying we have to have impact multiple. Targeting only one context when addressing a person's risk or protective factor is unlikely to be successful because people don't exist in isolation.